All right, good evening. I think we'll start. It's so nice to, after a Thanksgiving break, to see many of you back, which is wonderful. And I'm Dietrich Neumann, Director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. And I'm very happy to welcome you to the 11th in our series of conversations. And as you know, we've invited interesting artists and architects and writers, even a composer here, and they all have shown us new perspectives and images and ways of looking and thinking exactly how we imagine this series. And we have two more events after this one. One is Brett Smiley, who is actually running for mayor of the city of Providence next week. And then we have one after that, which is Howie Snyder and Islay Taylor from Steelyard here in Providence, which is a great community organization for arts. I've really long looked forward to this evening tonight. I think Thalia is one of the first I asked when this whole series started to be put together, and they will both challenge us to think in new and unexpected ways. Thalia and I know each other from a number of committees that we were on together, and I remember noticing what a brilliant writer she was. I remember distinctly how she made the normally dry prose of a strategic plan shine with brilliance and invention. And she went to Brown actually for her BA and MFA, and then began her career in theater in New York and Paris, Marseille and Berlin for many years before then turning to writing books. And her work infuses all different genres into the service of a playful and experimental approach to the page. Her early play, Hey, Stop That, was published in Theater Magazine, together with a number of essays on experimental theater and performance. She has also written a number of opera libretti and was commissioned by the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, to write an opera in 1992. And this cross-genre playfulness is also obvious in her performance novel called Ululu, yes, Clown Shrapnel, about the character Lulu. And she has two fiction essay collaboration with the French author and translator Abigail Lang, Prank of George, about Gertrude Stein's use of names to larger ecological and social questions, and Leave to Remain, Legends of Janus, where doubleness is explored in different areas, translation theory, French history, traitors, spies, and faux amis, Janus words. Her new book, Personhood, which you see here, is part of a trilogy in a way, because it began her interest in the sort of relationship of humans and animals, began with Bird Lover's Backyard in 2010. Then there was a novel in 2016, Experimental Animals, a reality fiction. And they all explore together with this one here, philosophical, linguistic, scientific, and very much aesthetic inquiries into animal-human narratives and problems. She joined Brown again, in a way, in 2000, and joined the Faculty of Literary Arts as the Adele Seaver Kellenberg Professor of Literary Arts, and she teaches courses in creative practice, experimental and interdisciplinary practice, and eco-poetics in practice. And she's currently in her last year. She emphasizes, and I'm really sad to actually repeat that, but she's in her last year as faculty director of the Brown Arts Initiative, one of the areas where we collaborated a little bit. And she's going to be in conversation with Thangam Ravindranathan. She's a professor over here, professor of French and Francophone Studies at Brown University. She went to the University of Pennsylvania and Université de Paris 8, Vincennes Saint-Denis, for comparative French literature, and got her PhD there. And she teaches and researches broadly modern and contemporary French literature and critical thought. The first book reflected on travel in a really interesting and sort of subversive way, travel in 20th century French literature, Là où je ne suis pas, récit de dévoyage, and that includes meditations on Jean-Paul Sartre and Georges Perec and others. Another book is Donner l'échange, L'impense animale, where already this sort of interest in animal and human relationships also shines. And that's exactly what she's currently working on, questions relating to animals and ecology. And her latest book is actually titled Behold an Animal for Exorbitant Readings, that came out last year. So this is going to be a very, very interesting conversation, lots of new ideas and thoughts. So please Welcome, Thalia Field and Thangam Ravindranathan. I think we have the microphone access.
Yeah, I think so. Can everybody see or hear us if we're sitting? Is that okay?
These chairs can roll around. So remember that. And
Here, this
also,
is your
if anyone can't see us, please roll around to where you can.
That could be very theatrical. All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Dietrich, for having us. And thank you, Tom.
Okay, so I guess, well, I'm here only because Thalia is very modest and very generous. And so when she got this invitation to give a talk, effectively, she said, I'd like to do it with someone. I'd like to be in conversation with someone. And so she named me. And so I feel very honored and very delighted and a bit bashful, actually, to have been named for this task. And I'm just sort of rather blown away by this book that does all kinds of things, but that is powerful, moving, educational, polemical, theatrical, poignant, and also quite challenging in places. So really looking forward to this conversation and to asking a whole lot of dumb questions, if I may, because I would just like to understand certain things better and to prompt you to speak as much as possible about the various things that you're doing in this book. So in your own words, you call it a collection of stories that focus on wild animals that we hold captive, literally, figuratively, psychologically, imaginatively. And it's a series of pieces. I don't even want to call them chapters. They're really pieces, each sort of constructed around a very different sort of set of formal intentions as well as sort of conceptual. So I'm hoping that you're going to, I'm hoping we'll have the chance to both talk about the general project and spend some time perhaps on some of these pieces individually. And my first sort of general question would be something like, well, as you were preparing today's remarks, you told me that you'd like your subtitle to be Storytelling and the Animal. And it made me think, oh, well, that's actually, depending on whether one sort of starts a reflection and a conversation on this book under the title Personhood or under the title Storytelling and the Animal, one actually might end up talking about this book quite differently. So I guess my question is, can you talk about your own sort of sense of whether this is a book about, I mean, what would be the different stakes of reading it as a book about personhood or as a book more generally about storytelling and the animal, where personhood sort of weaves in and out as a kind of problem and a lure and maybe a cracked mirror. And cracked mirror is something that kept sort of staying with me as a kind of image for this book.
Thank you all for coming. I just want to say that I am never as articulate in speech as I am in my actual work. So I want to preface that, like, the book really does my work for me. That's why I'm a writer. And I hope if you're interested at all that you'll actually just try to read the book, because I'm never going to say it as well as I do when I do my actual art. So I feel like the two, it's a very good question, because storytelling and personhood are both tangled up in the human narrative, meaning I think that personhood itself is a fiction that we talk about, whether it's in legal or psychological terms, or even spiritual or philosophical terms. It itself is already a story. And so I think that part of what my project is to confuse or point at a confusion that already exists around how we define humanness and personhood, and therefore create fictions that entangle the non-human world in our confusion and our narcissism around those issues. So I'm looking at different ways in this book. I'm looking at different ways in which the criminal, the legal, there are certain superstructures of mythology that the animals get caught up in. There's how animals become criminal, how animals become bound up in the legal system as either persons or property, for example. So, and what kind of discussions do we have about notions like sanctuary or birth and death? Like, where does the individual or population and individuals? And again, even the mirror that you bring up, which is used as a test of consciousness for certain animals within scientific circles, seems to me a very emblematic of our confusion around how to even begin to talk about our compatriots on this planet. So that's what I guess I would say. Does that begin to answer that? The two are entangled. The idea of personhood and our human storytelling are intricately confused.
So I do see this book as a very deep meditation on storytelling, the politics of storytelling, the kinds of sort of effects and entrapments that can occur through the choices of how to tell a story, what story to tell, where to make it begin, and where to make it end, and every piece is a kind of reflection on this. Just to continue on the mirror, since you also brought up that mirror test. So you say in a recent interview, the nature of the animal-human problem is exactly narcissistic and has all the props of narcissus. And some of what you've said here sort of allows us to continue thinking about this, how in a sense the human sort of definition of self or person is very much premised on this idea that one should be able to recognize oneself as a self, and that one should be able to therefore concretely recognize oneself in the mirror. And in the case of this extraordinary second piece in this book called Happy That You Have the Body, which is a reflection on Happy the elephant, who for more than 40 years has been at the Bronx Zoo, and who is, I believe, awaiting a habeas corpus hearing that will happen in January, where the head of the what is it called, the Non-Human Rights Project, is wanting to argue that Happy is a person on the basis, in fact, of this mirror test, that Happy is the first elephant to have passed in 2005. Looking at herself in the mirror, was able to actually try to erase this mark that had been made on her face, and therefore passed this test. And on the basis of this test, this lawyer, is he a lawyer, Stephen White?
Yes, he's the
has been arguing that Happy is a person, and therefore as a person should have the right to liberty, this being the common law of habeas corpus, the right not to be detained because you have the body. And so this is an extraordinary piece where you end up sort of reflecting on the irony of the mirror test, in a sense, because you know it's not an unproblematic test at all, right? But in this case, it is sort of strategically, perhaps it can be mobilized in the service of Happy, and perhaps in the longer term, it may pose a real challenge to the very rationale for keeping wild animals captive. I mean, certain wild animals captive. So, can you say something about your your research for this piece, your optimism regarding the category of personhood as it is being sort of leveraged in this particular case?
I mean, that piece was written in, I've worked with that group for quite a number of years. When experimental animals came out, will this go backward if I?
Yes.
Yeah, so when experimental animals came out, I had a big launch party in New York that was a benefit for this group. I very much believe in. So when the Happy case was just beginning to really gain momentum, I wrote that piece. It was actually published on their website first, and then I've reworked on it a bit. But you may have heard of this piece because it's gaining now a lot of attention. Lawrence Tribe just wrote about it. Martha Nussbaum has been writing about it. It's really become very much a cause célèbre. But this group has been working on personhood as a legal idea, and as the book talks about in other ways, you know, we also in a global sense, you know, rivers and mountains and other entities have been granted personhood in other countries, and so there's a international movement about what is what is a legal personhood and why is it an important category? As many of you know, obviously corporations are persons. I mean, it's not like, it's a category that has nothing to do with humanness, right? It's a legal fictional category that creates characters that act in a certain way in the world. So I'm not advocating, I think I have every critique of it as a be all and end all. It just happens to be where the conversation is. And that's what I'm always interested as an artist. I'm not, these pieces are not, they're essay, fiction, theater, they're funny. I try to really lighten it up with a lot of humor. So even though it can come across when we talk about it, like it's very serious, but I'm actually very interested in the absurdity of these conversations. That's actually much more artistically my modality is absurdity, because I feel like what happens is that we run into these staring contests where you've got these absurd things pitted against each other, such as, did the elephant move the mark? Well, what if it didn't feel like moving the mark? Like, what kind of test is that? Like, if you put them on children fail this test all the time. Are they not persons? And so I get tangled up. I think that critiquing scientific methodology around animal practice is something I've done through many of my books. In Bird Lover's Backyard, I have an extensive sequence on Konrad Lorenz and his pseudoscience. And so I'm interested in, and then Experimental Animals is really about Claude Bernard and the origins of vivisection, the origin of the laboratory in 19th century France. And really a lot of how the narrative around how we approach the scientific use of animals really began in a sort of farcical marriage between Claude and his wife, who was really one of the first anti-vivisection activists. And so you get this kind of absurd marriage that has actually led to almost the entire situation we find now. So I'm interested in how, and so in Personhood, I did, in Bird Lovers, it was really a lot about domesticated animals. And in Personhood, I really tried to focus more on the sense of the wild and the captive. And this question of criminality, legality, trespass, invasive species, all the places in which kind of policy and legality continue to try to tell us a story about who's in, who's out, who's a person, who's not, who belongs, who doesn't. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, beautiful answer. And thanks also for correcting the sort of over seriousness that I can.
Well, no, it's not you. It's not you. It's just that these are such horrible, tragic things.
Right.
I mean, honestly, I write this out of tragedy.
Yes.
But my response to tragedy is absurdity for some artistic reasons. So I just want to say that because there are many, many people who work in this field who literally dedicate their life in ways that I could not get up every day and do. I've spent, the first piece in this book is about the bird sanctuary where that's Poppy, one of the cockatoos, where I worked for 2 years, and just going there was heartbreaking. I would leave crying. So the fact that people do the work of taking care of the damage that we do to animals is extraordinary. I respond in a bit of humor. I'm gonna cry because that sanctuary had a huge fire and 160 birds died, of which only 2 cockatoos survived. So it just happened this year. So Poppy is no more, but that wasn't true when I wrote the piece. That the workers who work in this area, I have immense respect for.
Did Adam survive?
Nope. The only Buddy and one other cockatoo made it out of the wing. It's just an electrical fire in the wing where the cockatoos were. But these birds lived for 80 years, so many of them were just middle-aged. It was just an immense tragedy. Foster parents, if you're interested in their work, they're in Hope Valley, Rhode Island. Extraordinary place.
So this was April of this year when Thalia's book was already in production, and she already spent this time volunteering at the parrot sanctuary, as it's called, the foster parrot sanctuary. And the last I heard, it was 80+ birds, so I'm sort of devastated to know it's now 160.
Yeah, it was a terrible fire.
Yeah. But the choice, of course, of working on wild animals in captivity it also means that you are sort of faced with there being no possible happy solution, right? There is no happy, I mean, to use the word happy again, which is sort of so full of sort of irony and poignancy, but there's no happy solution here in the sense that wild animals have no world left on some level. I mean, there's no place to release them back to, and then often in any case, they're not in a state to be released back in any case, if there were a place for them to go to. And sanctuary becomes a really important notion there. And the first piece set in the parrot sanctuary is partly a reflection on this, right? That they are refugees. Right. They are refugees from the story that we have enrolled them in. And their refugee status comes partly from them having this capacity to love for life. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Like what makes the parrot a particularly or the cockatoo in the case of Adam, what makes them particularly sort of interesting figures to work
Well, the
with?
genesis of that piece, it's called Hi Adam, because Adam was a parrot who would say, hi, Adam, over and over when you would get there. And then all the rest would say, hi, Adam. And I was so taken, first of all, because Vicki Hearn, who I don't know if any of you know about, she was a dog trainer and a philosopher from Yale, who I worked with as a dog trainer and was very influential on me. She died a number of years ago. I write about her a lot in Bird Lovers. But her book is called, of course, Adam's Task, which is about the human need to name and the mythological basis of that propensity that we use language to kind of name and control. So here's Adam, this bird, singing its own name as a greeting to me in this weird sort of mess of symbolic, and so I was really taken with that, and that's what created the basis of that piece. But yeah, well, one of the tragedy of course of parrots in captivity is that they do mate for life, and they become very bonded to their humans, but they outlive their humans. They live 80 or 100 years, so they're often adopted when people are grown-ups, and then those people inevitably die. So or move or get married or whatever, and they can become very possessive of their person and become very untenable as a household pet. And so the sanctuary is filled with these sort of mourning widower parrots who can't really bond with other birds. It's a very existential situation. And that sense of desire and love. And at springtime, they all just come alive hormonally, and their plumage gets bright, and they become just these raging machines of desire. And it's very dangerous, and they attack. It's an amazing world of tragedy, absurd tragedy, which is always kind of how I think of it. So and we've created this world, and so that was really the genesis of the piece. I can read the end. I want to read the end, just the very last section of that piece. It doesn't really give the whole piece away, but it gives you a sense of kind of. Scientists explain that how guilty we feel about what we as humans might owe other beings should depend only on a species encephalization quotient, EQ. The nonlinear regression formula proposes to reveal intelligence and then equate intelligence with consciousness. A raven is 2.49, an elephant 2.36, a dog 1.2, a squirrel 1.1, humans are 7.6. Scientists defend this right to measure the sheer number of neurons, to sum up who is more or less conscious and intelligent. But who can make sense of neurons across species worlds? What common problem can everyone solve? What common problem does everyone have? It turns out that the highest EQ is found in frugivores, which parrots are, obviously. And scientists speculate this is because locating and picking ripe fruit demands a complex trichromatic map of visual space. So is Adam's problem to have been born in God's garden without a flock or flight or any way to prove he can obey the right rules? Hi, Adam, God said in a sing-song baby voice, wiggling his finger into the feathered belly. Who's a good boy? Adam, who's a good boy? And the big guy said, let there be a living room. And then the guy separated the living room from the kitchen, and he saw that this was good. So he said, let a garage go off the kitchen. And this was good. So the guy said, Let's fence in some grass and add a few hydrangeas. He saw that these were good, and these are the generations of X. And the guy said, let us have a pet to amuse us indoors. So he bought an illegally smuggled, wild-caught pet store parrot, named it Adam, and saw that it was good. And the guy and his wife begat 2 children and said, let us talk to Adam when funny and cute and ignore Adam when the television is on. And the children wanted to let Adam out of the cage. So the guy said, let the living room not be covered in shit. And it was not so good. And there were years and there were vacations and there were nights and days. And the guy and his wife and 2 children saw that Adam only liked one of them now and bit the rest if they came into the room and screamed all the time and plucked her feathers out. Then the neighbors complained and the guy said, let Adam live in the basement where no one can hear. And Adam was not in their image. And the big guy got angry because the screams and the bloody biting were upsetting the family. Banishing the bird to the basement was not enough, so he said, let Adam go forth from the house and mateless and heartbroken will be his days. It seemed that like that's all there was these days, the biters, screamers, liars, and those who couldn't follow simple rules. So it came upon everything that the guy said, lo, I'm going to destroy them, and it said the guy along with the earth. But the guy's son Noah was a good boy and of a kind who had learned over generations how to be docile, to listen to the guy's orders, to follow the rules and never bite or hide, lie, steal, or fly away. Only Noah, the good boy, would survive. This time we're going to do it right, said the guy. This time, no garden, no fruit, no talking snake. This time it's all surveillance from the get-go, all stage set and props. Flood the planet, start with that. Then we'll get a good houseboat, cement rooms, and a 9-gauge steel, and good old Noah to steer us to Mars. No more bountiful growth, no more floored ecstasies set among unique forms of life. All will be spaceship and robots and short-snouted, floppy-eared, baby-faced customers. With you, my beloved pets, I shall make my zoo and covenant. You shall live in cages 2 by 2 under video and LED. The pairs will bond and mate in captivity or not at all. Thus it was that Noah did all that. He did everything the big guy commanded, and he named and paired off pets. And lo, as the waters swelled and churned and rose up over the mountains, there was only one face upon the earth.
I'm so glad you read that. And then there are a couple of moments in this piece where hi, Adam is coming from all over the place, right? So there's a kind of hall of mirrors effect. But can you say a little bit more about biting in this piece? Because I know of the importance of Vicky Lynn's thinking for you, and I know that there's a moment where she talks about the bite as signaling a moment of failure of language. In the relationship of training that one would have with a dog in particular. And here, of course, it's about parrots not being allowed to bite, biting being the wrong thing to do, and this being also part of sort of the logic of how sort of absurd it is to try to translate the world of, say, the rainforest into the world of an apartment where all the things that the parrot would do right in the rainforest are sort of wrong in the apartment. Yeah, can you say more about biting?
Yeah, biting is something which has, I use kind of Vicky's thinking about it, which is that it's outside of the grammar of, or the syntax of training or whatever. So in Bird Lover's Backyard, that book, I do talk about, she has a book called Bandit, which was, because she became one of the few legal guardians of pit bulls who were on death row in Connecticut. And so she wrote a book about a dog named Bandit. And so I was from working with her, it planted the seed in my mind about this relationship between the law and sort of social constructs of good and bad dogs, which is a sort of another topic. But in this book, I do travel through, that kind of the grammar of how we interpret violence from animals, or what we call violence from animals, when animals are acting outside of our possible understanding of the grammar of the meaning of what they're doing. So the bite represents in a little way that. But other pieces in the book all still continue to talk about this kind of policy, legal network and structure of how behavior gets read, and in particular how animal behavior gets read.
do you want to segue on to true crime, nature fakers? Because that's one of the pieces here that's perhaps sort of most, I don't know what to call it, like a refracted and distributive in its sort of form, interactive as well and fun, also a little daunting if one is not used to that kind of writing. So if you can just explain what's going on with that. And I know that you're sort of referring that to literary naturalism, and therefore that's also a place where you are maybe doing certain things in continuity with the previous book as well.
Yeah, so this was actually, so the Nature Fakers refers to an early 19th century controversy of Theodore Roosevelt when he got involved with Jack London, and we get into a huge argument over who knew wild animals better. And it was very much an interesting debate, of course, because neither of them were correct about most of anything they were saying. They were both kind of hunters, and like their motives and their participation were also kind of interestingly skewed. I was also interested in, because in Experimental Animals, Emile Zola, so that book is written as a collage of historical voices. It's really a portrait of that time in 19th century France when the animal was really becoming a hugely important figure in everybody's imagination, sort of pro or con in terms of vivisection, but also Zola and the way he really formulated the beast within as a foundation of sort of naturalist thinking. And so I was very interested in that kind of the self-criminal, the weird, it's almost like we have to reject ourselves through the animal, and the notion of the beastly, and of course with the overtones of kind of like the Karens of our world who accuse kind of in a racialized, specialized sense, like what they're so afraid of, and they project it out, and it's always somehow animalistic. And so that this piece is a little bit of an exploration of these themes, but it's written, I'm going to read it a tiny bit because I think people get very intimidated by the form. The form I developed when I actually did work in theater, and it is a distributed authorial voice, intended not to prompt kind of refracted thought, but also when it's done in theater terms, these prompts are projected, so you would know the prompt, but the players say things within the prompts. It's a little hard to own that, but it's a game that the audience plays along with the players, but it allows the individual voice of the thinking mind. It's not my authorial voice. I'm just so. I believe in it. It's an aesthetic that I've done. So let me just read just a tiny bit. You can hear how it sounds when I'm reading from it. The piece is a bit of a crime story with detectives and a whole little narrative that goes on in a sort of 50s noirish way. True crime nature fakers. Consider if definition house is not the same as 5 synonyms for house, or any of 6 words used for the living spaces of animals. Recall 3 things we see when a hand draws a frame, and then 10 things outside the frame, especially if there's a definition animal in it or outside it. Consider 4 signs of drought, 3 forms of environmental degradation, and 10 recent large-scale disasters. Consider 3 kinds of animals that break into houses. Consider definition criminal, i.e., a fox came in housewise and became me and was no longer wild because it was housed through me, as me almost, as if in a primal crime scene. The fox did things in my place and stood for me in ways I can and can't stand, and its eyes flickered with particularity as though this one fox was now a family member who would know my food and arrange my clothes and pillows, just like someone I know or who would know me namishly. This fox in my chair left me presents like a lover or a child would, cursed me, undermined me, and stole precious items like a lover or a child would. In this particular fox, I saw what I see only when it looks through my things, through my self-organized rooms. 4 differences between a mirror and a house. 2 times someone told you to be reasonable. CF, you have the look of the beast. Step to the front stoop, make the call to the police. Help, you might say. 2 descriptions of physical violence and 1 definition, sin. 3 differences between a wolf and a dog. Definition, prison, i.e., In my house, 5 bad habits or 2 bad intentions aren't enough to dehumanize me. Evil is the skin thing, the arrangement of puzzle parts, ears, hair, muzzle, paws, things I blame for any bodily break-in when hitting my child or peeing in the yard. The beast takes the blame. 5-sentence recap of literary naturalism. Definition: instinct.
So on the next page, there's this other amazing passage, CF, is this not my street, forest, my field, my driveway? Is this not my hideout? Is this not my timber frame, my toilet, my self-serving phrase? Did that wolf not wear my skimpiest nightie and flounce in it? So I have a sort of reading of this piece, even if it's the one that I felt most daunted by. I want to submit my reading to you and see what you think. And it partly has to do with the fact that with a few people here, we have this seminar on French ecological thought this semester, and we were reading Derrida a couple of weeks ago, and I know that Derrida on the Animal is a text that you and I have talked about as well.
The cat seeing him naked. That
yes, and I feel like in the first chapter you are sort of rewriting Derrida in places, but here I want to ask another kind of question. So there's a place in that in the I think third seminar of Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am, where he seems to be really interested in the fact that the eye, the human eye, is really sort of premised on an exclusion of the animal or a domination over the animal, or indeed the capacity for violence against the animal, right? So there's very much a way in which one could almost read that literally, dramatically, and this is partly what I feel is going on in this chapter, that in this piece, that you're actually talking about the eye as this construction that is very much sort of in a logistical and rhetorical and theatrical way, constantly premised on that kind of demonization of the animal and domination over the animal. So is this a way to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Yes, I think that because if you like in experimental animals, that the idea of sacrifice, which when you hear scientists talk about killing the animals that they work on, they're sacrificing them. I think we lived under the long shadow of the use of animal bodies to in fact, one of my next projects is on the scapegoat, because I believe that we use the animal body to expunge our shadow selves. I mean, we can't, and so there is something that we must dominate, we must control. And I hesitate to say these things in this way. I really, in the work is where I can really articulate it better, but or not articulate, but make it as complex as I feel it to be. But yes, I do think that through these very confused linguistic narrative mythologies and all the entanglements we get ourselves in, we get an F. We get an F. I don't know how to, we get an F when it comes to animals. And I don't know why that is. I don't have a theory on that, but I think we get a real F.
And home is working very much like person here, right? In the sense that the borders of that and the powers of that are constantly being traced against the animal, including the animal that we are.
Right. And so the invasive species sections, it goes a little to that, because we invent this notion of a sort of paradise of an ecology, and then we start to create whole ethics and moralities around invasive species. And so the ethics of that is taken up in another piece, because what are these maps? What are these countries? What are these origin stories? Where is grounds? Where is the 0 point? And yet there are real bodies and real lives at stake. There are real birds and real feral pigs and real, and that's the paradox that I always come back to. That paradox is the paradox of the relationship between our ideas and the truth of things, that's about suffering and care, that go beyond any way to talk about it. And I often want to get a piece to the point where I've sort of exhausted the language to the point where you just say, well, it's just wrong. Like, it's just wrong. Something is, and that feeling of connection to a wisdom, a kind of inner wisdom around, we are missing something important. We're missing a relationship that is crucial to us. And we are alienated from ourselves because of it. That truth, I think, is what I ultimately am driving for.
So
Do we need to ask
I
them
completely
questions?
forgot to ask how much time we had. So I'm just going on to 10 o'clock. So at what point should we open things up?
I think this would be a perfect moment.
Maybe now.
It's so inspiring and interesting. I have a question, but I'll wait time. Anyway, so, which is, not fully serious, but obviously you both work on this relationship between humans and animals. And the most obvious question I have to ask is, do you actually have a pet at home? How has your research changed the way you interact, in case you have one?
I do. Well, I had my dog Lila, who I wrote about in Bird Lovers, was the reason I met Vicki Hearn to begin with, was because I adopted Lila, and I didn't have any clue how to, and Lila changed my life. I was a very depressed person. I've always struggled with depression and all kinds of things. And Lila just got me outside, and it was a kind of revelation to me. And so when Lila learned to sit, I also started meditating. And so there was an interesting revelation around the use of sitting as a space for command, for learning, for listening, it sort of unleashed an entire series of things. So Lila was an extremely important dog to me. I also had dogs growing up. I grew up in the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park, and several of our dogs were stolen when I was very little, and it really truly impacted me. And I remember the policeman saying once, like, well, it's just normal around here. It happens all the time, and I didn't realize at the time that these were dog stealing rings that were feeding dogs to the laboratories in the neighborhood and in Chicago. And it didn't connect until I'd written an entire book about the origins of vivisection in the library that I had reconnected back to this childhood trauma around the loss of my pet dogs. Anyway, so yes, some dogs.
And no pets in my case, but it's a very active kind of not having of a pet, if that makes any sense. So
Every day you don't have a pet. You get up and you say, I'm not going to have a pet today.
Well, my husband is in this room, and he knows that every day we do talk about that, whether we should have a pet and why we shouldn't have a pet and why we don't have a pet. But I feel as if the reason why we don't is sort of deeply in connection with the kinds of things you write about, because actually my favorite kind of pet is the impossible pet. It is the feral dog, the stray dog in the streets of India, where I go quite often. I love the stray dog, and I know that to have it would be precisely to destroy it as what it is. So
it's interesting.
So yeah. So it's an endlessly philosophical question. Any other questions?
What's your thoughts around sort of the language of hunting? Okay? In one aspect, sport hunters talk about harvesting the herd to save them. And then you brought up feral pigs. And that's one where it's almost like this militaristic connotation, right? This invasive species, we're going to fly around in helicopters and gun them down. It seems like in both cases, people use different types of language to express their relationship to the animals in that.
Yeah, I haven't really written on hunting, but you're bringing up the thing that I would be most interested in as an artist, which is just how are people framing their understanding of their actions? Because that's, to me, like as a person who works in language, that's the texture of where the problem is often getting to. You get toward the problem when you start listening closely to the metaphors, to the mythology, to where authority is being drawn, to what people, to the euphemisms involved. So I tend to write more on like the sciences, but I'm interested in the hunting. I mean, certainly in the feral pig section, I talk about the kaput feral hogbait, which is like one of the things they call warfarin, which is the poison that's used. There's a lot of sort of old Southern kind of, it's framed in this very kind of old boy way as a product, which I find kind of interesting. But that would, what you're asking would be exactly what I would sort of be interested in looking into. And I taught a class at Brown on animal sanctuaries, and we did interview people who run a lot of sanctuaries around the country. And one of the places was Mission Wolf in Colorado. And so it's interesting to talk to them about the relation between wolves and ranchers, for example, and the different ways that they've had to come together to really make a new story, because both stories were just kind of in a face-off and it wasn't going to go anywhere. So one of the efforts that they really tried to make was to start to tell new stories about how the coexistence of these populations can move forward together. So I think that, but you know, the ironies of hunting, of course, is what you're saying. I mean, that Ducks Unlimited is one of the biggest givers to a lot of conservation efforts in wetland restoration. So why do they want more ducks to shoot? But it kind of works for everybody. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, off on a tangent a little bit. With the increasing awareness of, I'll say, personhood of animals, are you aware of any legislation in country, let's say Paris, like Australia, or some of the South American countries where there seems to be a higher predominance of parrots, of changes, legislation to protect them in recognition? Well,
so the hippos, the famous cocaine hippos in Honduras, they were actually the first animals in America to ever get they got special personhood status to be able to have standing. Now that's not going to translate down, but in a US court, they were actually given that. And of course, South America, the Amazon, I mean, there's a lot of effort to make the river. There's some, I think actually Pakistan has a very, very, very progressive sentient being laws around animal, and so does Switzerland and places in Europe. So it's kind of a patchwork quilt of different approaches to this. On a conservation level, I think that what's most important, I think in another way, is that people are beginning to realize that we can't put maps on animal movement. So that, and this is something that Nancy Jacobs works on, who's not here, but she's a historian, but she works, that animals migrate, they move around. And so they don't live in one place often. And so they transpose themselves culturally across many different stories. And that's a real interesting problem for people working to help protect these animals, is that if you can have some protection here, but not here, you get into trouble. So this is being seen these days in a lot of bird populations in the US, where somewhere along their migratory route, they're running into trouble. How do you make a cohesive narrative for this bird? And I think people are beginning to do that kind of work now.
On page 27, you have a list of countries that have recently redefined animals as sentient beings. Brussels, cities and countries, Brussels, France, New Zealand, Quebec, Switzerland, Slovakia, Austria, and Egypt. And they have redefined animals as sentient beings and rather than things or property.
Right.
And to that, we can add a few more.
It's sensitive in the book, yeah. And in America, there's still property. Yeah.
It's a bit unformulated, but I think I'd like to ask you about a term that you haven't used, but it seems to be present in your thinking, particularly around the question of personhood. And I started thinking about it when you were talking about the elephant, who can, the mirror, it can recognize itself in the mirror, and it tries to erase the cross on its trunk and all that. One sort of, it made me think, of course, of Lacan's mirror phase as a definition of human subjectivity. And for Lacan, that is a moment of misrecognition. I mean, it's a moment of, but it's also a moment of mimesis. I mean, the person misrecognizes him or herself in the mirror, and in that sense attains subjectivity, attains person. And so I wonder whether, well, whether you might reflect more on the role of imitation or misrecognition in the evolution of this concept of personhood. And I suppose, is that, is there is the elephant distinct in that? I mean, how does this make you sort of, or how does this affect your conception of animal subjectivity? Is there a sort of continuum whereby a misrecognition happens at the high end of animal evolution, such as elephants, whereas maybe, but I mean, I thought of this also with relation to parrot, a high adder, imitating speech, and at that point attaining a certain kind of person.
Except Descartes called out the parrot in particular as mechanical imitation.
Right.
So actually in the consciousness discourse, that exactly is the proof that they are non-conscious. I mean, I'm not saying that, I believe that, but it's funny how the parrot has been used that way.
Lacan would say the same, right? I mean, we are, in a sense, manufacturing a kind of consciousness out of a sort of essentially mechanical operation.
I mean, when you're saying the misrecognition, I don't know Lacan. I don't know enough to speak intelligently there, but I will say that to me, what's interesting is the many, many ways that anthropomorphism is used. And I would say that across my 3 books, I have explored a variety of these ways. So there's a piece in here about the prophetic fallacy, in which I write it. This is maybe what's most important, in a very traditional nature writing fashion, which I'm critiquing, because part of my critique is that one of the troubles we're in is that the way in which nature writing exists is a very problematic aesthetic. And so that piece, which some people say to me, oh, it's my favorite piece in the book. Yeah, it's in a lot of ways, it's the most accessible, because I'm talking about the prophetic fallacy. It's a piece that is exemplifying our desire to anthropomorphize the world around us. I have other pieces, however, in which I'm using anthropomorphism as a mechanism of empathy. Like, I don't have one opinion on it, is I guess what I'm trying to say. I think that and I don't have any real opinion, and I'm not going to go, I try not to actually go into answering, well, what animal is this or that, or how do they feel? Because I'm much more interested in the human mess that we get ourselves into than trying to, I think if you relate to animals, you kind of know what's going on. I guess that's my bottom line. Like, when you are in the presence of suffering, you know it, period, end of story. You can try to pretend you don't, or you can not want to hear it, or you can not think about it. But, we live on a zoo planet now. Like, we've done it. Here we are. It's ours. We bought it. We broke it. We bought it. Now what? Well, okay. Well, so we have to be honest about our role now. It's all zoo. It's all us. So not that, but it's not. We are going to be eaten by all kinds of things before we know it, but we think it, and where is that trouble? So it's all of that misrecognition. It's like, we don't even recognize, in my mind, where we are in our own story. That's part of what I'm trying to get at. It's like, look at the mess of stories that we can't even, like, we see it this way, we see it that way. It's easy to prove that. And, oh, well, look, we can prove that. That authority and proof and truth that we keep trying to talk about animals as somehow showing this, showing that, doing this, doing, it's a lot of empty dead ends, frankly. So I'm probably more cynical than, but do you want me to look at that little section about the
Yes,
mirror?
please.
Because there's that one section, I don't know if you can find it quickly, where I do talk about the master dialect, the Lacan, a little bit about that.
Well, there's a section titled on the mirror stage, page 20. But
right. So, right. There's, but the mirror splits an object from oneself. To own the potential elusive person like a piece of furniture, a king among things, to be seen and sat on, to be cared for, but also to uphold yourself and do your duty, including to be marked or ridden if necessary, to be sold or sturdy or perhaps skinned or stuffed if necessary, to see oneself as others do, to be humbled, in other words, as a reflection of a world that would claim to name you, to ask you to please remove the mark, to prove yourself, to make something of yourself, a mental representation, begging the question if you have an eye, to see with it, or one to know yourself with your eyes, this external whole that sums up and idealizes what you might see of yourself, but always first a set of characteristics defined by relations and tests of how one perceives oneself through other eyes. So yeah, getting back and forth between whose eyes are in the mirror, really. We make ourselves a spectacle when we have to do a mirror test.
Kind of on this topic maybe of eyes and the eye and anthropomorphizing and perspective, I'm curious what your feelings or thoughts are on fiction that specifically uses animal narrators. Thinking of Kafka or Yoko Tawada's recent Memoirs of a Polar Bear, or Tolstoy's Axolotl, and the kind of ethical questions involved in that vis-a-vis some of those.
I think when it's done in a really complex way, it's exactly right. I mean, I think why not just go into the breach? It's really when it's done, I think Karen Joy Hart, that book, We Were All Completely Beside Ourselves, that's a masterpiece of the way in which, puts the animal in a narrative. You can tell when you're in the presence of kind of a complex exploration of what that is, so I don't have like a thesis statement about it. I think I think a lot of quote unquote nature writing is really anemic and really reinforces a human-centric point of view that's really damaging. So I feel like I work very hard to aesthetically not succumb to that kind of easily consumable experience, personal narrative, personal experience based, like how it affected me. Like that is much more onerous to me than people attempting a kind of journey outward. So yeah, I would have to.
Is it ever possible to look through these lines, feel what these scenes, speak with this voice, and not describe in front of me this?
Right.
It's impossible.
It is impossible. And yet you could be in the presence of another.
And yet
Right. So that's a paradox that I find extremely empowering.
Right, I agree.
It's not to deny, in a Buddhist sense, like if you're here, you're too much. If you're there, you've lost yourself. It's the relationship. It's that place in between. If you're doing meditation, it's you can't be either two in your brain or two out there. It's the same thing.
And I think you're very articulate. I think it's a very complex message. And I think but we can't think and see and hear and speak and not be truly done and create what we create.
That is the trouble. So we have to live with that, and yet we also have to be present to our impact. Right. So how do we live like that? It's very hard. It's funny and it's painful.
Maybe that's a good moment. I have two quick announcements, and of course, we invite you all to go next door and continue the conversation over a little wine and food as always. But I want to thank Bridget, who greeted you.
Can I make one announcement?
Yes, of course.
I just want to make one announcement because it might interest some of you. So that's Lightning. Lightning is still with us. But this category other.com, there's an incredible artist in New York named Ben Williams who has done an audio version of this book with actors, and it is phenomenal. So he's done the whole book now. You can buy the whole book on Audible, and it's all of the pieces, or you can piece by piece listen to them on categoryother.com for free. It's available in all kinds of places, but it's really an extraordinary work. I just really, I want to alert you to it because it just makes me so happy. Anyway.
Thank you. So before I thank both of them, just wanted to thank Bridget, who's putting the program together, and we're all set for next semester, but we have Brett Smiley, who's thinking about the future problems coming next week, and then Howie Snyder from Steelyard. And I wanted to thank Reese, who's out there and greeted you at the door. And I think that's all I had to announce. I wanted to say this was absolutely fantastic, exactly what I had hoped that you would make us think about things. We haven't really, many of us, including me, and I do have a pet at home who I really love. And, think about things in different ways. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.